Did you know that to get a bag like this of charcoal, you need to have cut down a 7-year-old tree? The data actually shows us that in Uganda, and I think in most African countries, the leading cause of deforestation is charcoal and firewood. That is why at We Planet Africa, we are calling upon you, Ugandans, Kenyans, Africans generally, to pledge to reduce your charcoal usage by 50%. For instance, if you have been using a bag of charcoal for 2 weeks, we are asking you to please consider using that bag of charcoal for 1 month. For a tree to make the good charcoal that you all want, you say you want hard charcoal, amanda amagumu. The tree must be at least 7 years old. So a tree like this would give you charcoal that you call ebireria or lusenyente, the one that you do not want. If you love the environment, if you care about the future, the environment that you're leaving for your children, please reduce your charcoal usage. We are not going to protect our environment by planting more trees. We are going to protect our environment by protecting the trees that already exist. Just by increasing your gas usage by 50%, you will be able to reduce your charcoal usage so that you can even cook food faster for these children. When they start crying, you cook your food quickly, you warm it faster, they eat and they stop crying and give you some peace. But also, most importantly, it will help with indoor air pollution. The data shows that 600,000 women in Africa lose their lives prematurely due to indoor air pollution, and it is mainly caused by particulate matter that comes from charcoal and firewood. Also, these children, while we're not watching, most of them have crawled and walked into open fires and they've gotten burns. So this is a good transitional option as we move towards electricity. That is our end game. So please don't forget to sign the reduced charcoal pledge.
So thank you for listening in. That was our director, Patricia Nantenza, speaking about the reduce charcoal campaign that we have running currently as part of the larger Switch on Africa campaign. And from there, I think I'll just move forward to our objectives for today, which is a webinar on the potential of hydropower in Africa and the opportunities and challenges. And basically, we see that Africa has a vast potential for hydropower generation, and yet millions of Africans still lack access to reliable electricity. And we see that something like the International Energy Agency shows that around 600 million Africans are energy poor with no access to electricity. And so here we seek to actually explore some of these opportunities and challenges of harnessing hydropower to meet Africa's growing needs. Yeah? And so today we are joined by our two panelists. We have Mr. Benson Ireri, who is the African lead energy access from the World Resources Institute. And Benson's work is mostly focused on leading the strategy and projects to accelerate the deployment of clean energy in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that includes providing strategic inputs to the World Resources Institute's overall energy programs engagement in East Africa, and also in realizing the organization's ambitions in the region. Benson works closely with different partners, including the civil society actors, private sector, and as well as policymakers to build an appreciation on user-centric approach to energy access. And our second panelist is Mr. Dan Malone, who is the chairman from the Hydropower Association of Uganda. And Dan has worked under the Department of Technical Regulation of the Technical Regulation in the Electricity Regulatory Authority of Uganda for 12 years. And after he went to head the EU-funded HYPOSO, which is the hydropower solutions project, where he has spoken at various international forums about investments, opportunities into small hydropower development in Africa, and also the REN Expo Interhydro in Austria and Africa 2023. He's also a member of the Uganda Committee on Large Dams and a founder of the National Executive Committee, founder and National Executive Committee member, and current chairman of the Hydropower Association of Uganda. So I just welcome our panelists. Thank you so much. We are excited to have you here and to gain multiple insights from you. And I think from there, we'll just move on forward to our first panelist, Mr. Benson. So maybe first, you can just give us a brief overview of what are the biggest challenges that hinder unlocking Africa's hydropower potential.
All right. Sorry. Thank you so much, Peter, for the opportunity to speak in this webinar. Hi, everybody. As Peter has mentioned, my name is Benson Ireri, and I work with the World Resources Institute, leading the energy access work for Africa. I'm based out of Nairobi, Kenya, just as a way of introduction. But I think also just to quickly mention, so WRI is a global think tank with our head office based in Washington, D.C., and we have a new strategy that is looking at system level transformation. And we're looking at three major systems. One of them is energy system. And I think, of course, from a strong conviction that for us to be in a position to reduce greenhouse gases and promote sustainable development, energy or decarbonizing energy sector is going to be one of the major systems that we have to transform. But the other part is also focuses on city level transformation. And the conviction again here is that with the growing population of Africa, cities, and the expansion and the demand that's going to bring with it, both in terms of energy, in terms of building infrastructure, etc., we definitely again have to see how do we support city level transformation so that it can be resilient and it can also be able to contribute to sustainable development. And the last one is on what we call food, land, and water. I think, of course, for us to be able to speak about sustainable development, food production and sustainable food production, for that matter, has to be at the center of the conversation. And when you look at issues to do it, for example, both food production, how do we sustainably produce food, but also in terms of reducing food loss and food waste. Again, you can be able to tell that energy is actually going to be at the critical or the center of it. So I felt it's important for me just to speak who WRI is just briefly before we get into the context of the conversation, so that you can all be able to know who this WRI is. No, thank you so much for your question, Peter. And I love the way you've actually framed the context. And I think just to replay what I've actually heard from you, and even just add a bit more. So we are 7 years, if not 6 years away from the realization of the Global Sustainable Development Goals. And as we look towards the deadline for the achievement of SDGs, in Africa, we still have around 600 million people who still don't have access to electricity. The sad part is that a majority of those are actually found in sub-Saharan Africa, a region where I think in terms of closing energy access gap and also improving investment for energy, for renewable energy for that matter, I think there has been significant challenges. Hydropower continues to play a major role in terms of provision of flexible power solutions in the continent. But of course, in terms of the potential that exists for hydropower to play this role, there's a huge opportunity that still remains untapped. I was just looking at statistics, and I think just to quickly cite here, is that first and foremost, I think one to appreciate is that the current electricity consumption in the continent stands at 732 terawatt hour, and this is expected to increase by 61% by the year 2030 from projections, reaching 1,180 terawatt hour. Now, by 2021, the gross generating capacity of all forms of energy in the region was standing at 245 gigawatts in 2021, right? And hydropower producing 17% of this total generating capacity. Now, by the time you're getting to then 2030 and the projected increase in energy consumption, as I've mentioned, hydropower is going to be still playing a critical role. And with that projection increasing from 17% in 2021 to around 23, 24% by the year 2030. But we still, by that time, will have still remained with around 118 gigawatts, 470 gigawatts of untapped potential from hydropower. And so I think looking at then, why do we still have significant potential for hydro that will be untapped vis-a-vis the potential that we have and the population that, for example, needs to be electrified? Then the bigger question becomes, why then are we having this slow pace in terms of hydropower penetration or exploration of hydropower? And I think I would be able to group the challenges for hydropower exploration into 5. So one of them is the impacts of climate change. I think increasingly, of course, hydro is significantly being affected by issues to do with drought and the changes in climate change, and what that means, for example, in terms of investors, for example, but also at the same time, from a policy point of view, when Kenya, for instance, drought comes, the generation capacity from hydropower significantly reduces. And I think that was even one of the reasons why Kenya then had to move significantly to exploring geothermal potential, purely just to meet the challenges or to overcome the challenges associated with drought and the impacts of drought to hydropower. Is that something that is going to continue influencing how, for example, policymakers see the opportunity for hydropower? But also more important, even in terms of investors, what are some of the climate change related risks that are associated with how investors, for example, then perceive the sector and their appetite, for example, then to have the confidence to invest in the sector? I think that's number one. But also number 2 is the increase now in the new technologies that we are having that are continuing to become cost competitive compared to hydropower. So whether you're speaking, for instance, about solar, and increasingly over the last 10 years, I think we have seen a significant reduction in the overall cost of solar power. But at the same time, again, in terms of the cost for wind, for instance, again, becoming extremely cost competitive. And so looking at then how does hydro, for example, compete in such a context with some of these emerging technologies, and what exactly does that mean in terms of the exploration of full potential? I think for hydropower will continue to become one of the challenge, I think, that we'll be seeing. And even more, I think it's looking at the overall cost of investment for hydro. I think just knowing how significantly, specifically large hydropower projects, they are quite cost intensive. And the projected continued reduction in the cost of solar, for example, the projected reduction of cost for example, wind, that I think will continue becoming something that we have to watch. And we can be able to see how then do we tap into, or how do we help in terms of reducing, for example, the cost of hydro or investment in hydropower. The third piece, I think I would look at it in terms of project bankability, and particularly here looking at issues to do with credit risks for domestic off-takers, and also the risk-reward imbalance in the eye, especially as you look at it in the eyes of the investors. So again, how do we improve the bankability of some of these projects, and how do we address some of these perceived risks? Could actually be perceived or real risks, but especially as the way investors look at them from a hydropower technology point of view, I think for me becomes quite critical for us to be able to look at how we can be able to address that. And then finally, and I'm pretty sure, of course, my counterpart, Dan, coming from this sector more specifically, will have a lot to also add on to what I'll just have painted. I think for me is the geopolitical issues or sensitivities associated, for example, with hydro potential water potential, for example, etc. And more specifically, I think just speaking about the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance project, and I think the risk that you could be able to see associated with the tension between Egypt and Ethiopia that took a bit long for such a project to be initiated, and by the time it took to actually then initiate the projects. Does this kind of, again, resource challenges or cross-country challenges, again, for instance, pose a challenge to exploration of the full potential for hydro? And then I think finally, for me, I would look at it in terms of energy consumption or demand for energy consumption. And what does that mean? In terms of, again, increased investment, generally both in hydro, but I think also cuts across other energy, is that we have seen even for the countries where there has been increased investment in energy and even, for example, closing the energy access gap, I think consumption still remains a major challenge. And hence also affecting the confidence of the investors, that if we are increasing our energy production or energy generation for that matter, but then the consumption again is not as major or as significant, what does that mean in terms of then the end user managing to repay whatever that would be required, which by the investor, which again increases or adds onto the list of the risks that are perceived. And hence, even as you look at then, how do we promote the energy sector, including the hydro power sector? How do we address issues to do with stimulating demand for energy consumption as a way of building confidence from the investor to increase the investment? I think that's what I would paint as 5 key highlights for me as far as challenges for exploration of full potential for hydropower is concerned.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Benson. I think those are pretty clear challenges that may hinder the implementation of hydropower. So maybe I'll move on to Dan. And my question to you is, maybe you can tell us the importance of hydropower. And also, while you're discussing that, also tell us, how do we balance the environmental and social sustainability of hydropower development in Africa?
Okay, thank you, Peter. And it's an evening from Kampala, Uganda. I think we're all at the same East African time zone. I'm glad to be on this forum. Benson has already spoken very well. He has articulated the issues that we face in the hydropower sector, especially on the continent of Africa. So I might not be able to repeat whatever he has said because they were all very strong points. But like you pointed out, I think like any development, even the development of hydropower also has the downside. For example, in Uganda here, we had one of the biggest projects before Karuma, 600 megawatts comes on board. We had the Utagali power project of 250 megawatts. It started well as a solution for our problems that we're having in terms of power blackouts. So everybody was looking for having this hydropower plant on board. But eventually, I think we had challenges, especially from the side of the environmentalists and other people that are interested in, for example, preserving the cultural sites along the River Nile. They had to get up in arms and, they struck ground and they said, cannot go ahead with this kind of hydropower project because of the negative impact we have on the social and in the environment of the country, especially along the banks of the river. So, but eventually, to cut the long story short, just like Peter, you've asked, all it is had to come to a roundtable discussion, because sometimes when you're selfish and you look at yourself alone, it's very possible to want to go all the way, not thinking about the effects on the other party, where you're impacting. For example, the project affected persons that are always a common feature in most of these plants that we develop in terms of hydropower and other new energy projects. So I think I'll be brief. One of them, first of all, need parties, the environmental conservationists, those that are interested in preserving the cultural preservation. They were all supposed to come together, sit down, and okay, just a minute. All right. They need to come together and sit and look at the pros and the cons of both hydropower development and what is there before that hydropower project has come on board. So I think that was one of the first points that gave a win-win situation to both parties. One, because much as we needed the cultural sites preserved, we also needed the environment to preserve the flora and the fauna, the aquatic species, some of them that were endangered. That was very important. But also, there was no way that we could continue in having that kind of load shedding where you could have only power maybe in 6 hours, in the 24 hours or 48 hours. It wasn't really productive. It was actually counterproductive. So that kind of dialogue, roundtable dialogue between the two parties, I think that was the first stop where all parties were helped to start off and have a good discussion and then agree to get a midpoint to see how we can move forward in terms of having the hydropower project go on, but at the same time, also having being able to preserve all our good qualities in terms of environmental preservation and the cultural preservation. Well, that was specific for Bujagali hydropower project, but sometimes there are also other issues that we can come up. For example, normally before we go around to start such a project, it's a must that we already have a feasibility study. Now, the feasibility study highlights all the interventions for every social and economic or environmental issue that has been pointed out, and how the project developer will be able to address it in the long term during the lifetime of developing the hydropower plant. So this is normally specific to respective small hydropowers, big hydropower projects, whatever hydropower project that comes on board. Before it starts the process of developing, there must be that feasibility study that has been approved by the regulators to see how you as the developer, you're going to address all the issues that were pointed out and that were raised and listed and highlighted in your pre-feasibility studies. So, of course, these are site-specific. We cannot say there's one that cuts across the board, but otherwise, whatever normally comes out in a pre-feasibility study, just before a power project can come to have what we call a power purchase agreement to actually tell you that now you're ready to start the development of this plant. That's one of the most important tools that you're supposed to have. The others are really general, they're cross-cutting, but maybe you can share more as we go along. That's what I wanted to highlight for now, Peter. I want to thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Maybe as we move forward, I'd like to request our panelists to limit their responses to around 5 minutes so we can stay within time. And also a reminder that you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at We Planet Africa. And I've just shared the hashtags that we'll be using for this conversation today. You can use #SwitchOnAfrica and #ElectricityForAll to continue the conversation even online. So we'll move on back to Benson. You mentioned something about cost of investment as one of the hindrances to actually the adoption of hydropower within Africa. So maybe you can tell us, are there any new technologies that can make hydropower more cost-effective and more efficient.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think I will be allowed to keep my video off. I realized, okay, thank you. That's fine. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think, how would I frame this? So I think in the context of the emerging technologies in the renewable energy space, one of the things or one of the challenges that we've realized, or that definitely is a known one, for the new technologies, including solar, wind, for example, is the lack of their sustainability, which therefore then means integrating them onto the grid becomes a major challenge. I mean, for example, solar, you cannot be able to generate solar in the evening. You cannot be able to generate wind power throughout because it's not all the time that, for example, wind blows. And therefore, one of the key investment requirement even for the rest of the renewable, and especially for the new technologies, solar, wind, etc., is a question of storage. Now, storage overall is a major challenge because it's quite expensive. I think, again, which has also become a bit of a challenge for those new technologies. And I think the reason why I'm painting this is to mean that even in the context of the challenges that I've spoken about hydro, there's still a unique opportunity for hydro to play as a natural energy storage. I think for me, I would first and foremost just open that conversation with that in the renewable energy-centric world, we see energy storage being critical, and this is where hydropower becomes quite critical. And dams in that context, in our opinion, can be in a position to play basically what we call a natural battery function or storage function, storing energy for times when the sun doesn't shine or when the wind doesn't blow. And I think this dual role of dams, both as power generators and storage units, could also ensure their relevance in the future energy mix. So I think that's number one. Number two is a question of digitalization of hydropower operation. I think we've seen a lot of emerging technologies in as far as digitalizing energy generation, energy power sector management playing a critical role. The only thing, again, that we see is that for most of the old hydropower dams, for example, then they didn't have that function. Now, as we continue then to build new hydropower dams, I think digitalizing them in a way, then we can be able to see how can the role of big data, for example, play in balancing between the potential for hydropower and how we can be able to improve storage for that matter, and also balancing between hydropower, for example, and other variables that needs to be integrated into the grid. I think for me becomes quite critical. So yes, digitalization of hydropower operation becomes quite important. The third part, which I think is also linked with the digitalization conversation, is the whole role of regional power pools that I think we see. And for me, I think one of the key things that we have seen, for example, as a driving factor, for example, for the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance project, you go to the Grand Inga Dam in DRC Congo, I think is the ability for countries to trade power across each other. And hence also improving in terms of then the confidence of investors. And so I think what I'm trying to say is how we can be able to then implement and we can be able to execute regional power trading, I think becomes quite critical, and also more important, even in the context of then improving these regional power trading and regional power pools, for example, again, the whole place of digitalization, I think for me, again, becomes quite important also in terms of system balancing. And then finally, I think we have seen a significant role, for example, of geospatial tools that are helping to inform, for instance, where we have all these renewable energy potential or sources, including hydro for that matter. And I think also mentioning, for me, I think it's not just a question about large hydropower projects, but also we have small hydropower projects which can also be able to play a critical role, especially where then, for example, you want to minimize the cost of power transmission, power distribution. I think contextualized small hydropower projects can be able to play a major role. And so using tools or geospatial tools that can be able to demonstrate where these opportunities are, what is the size of these opportunities, I think could become quite important in terms of even helping investors, for example, be in a position to see where those locations are, what is the population that would, for example, be served by some of these small hydropower projects, but also large hydropower projects for that matter. And also the kind of investment that would be required to unlock or to fully unlock those opportunities. So yeah, I think I would be able to club them into those 4: energy storage, digitalization of hydropower operation, the regional power pool and the integration of power systems, and finally, the role of geospatial tools. And just speaking about geospatial tools, WRI has been developing one tool called Energy Access Explorer, which maps out all these renewable energy resources, including hydropower and their size, across a couple of countries. But I think for the context of this conversation, I can confidently tell you we've mapped out all the potential across Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. We've also mapped out for Zambia, for example, and Nigeria. And it's a commitment that we also have in terms of seeing how can we be able to map out some of these resources to also demonstrate to investors, for example, where they exist, and hence be in a position to help in terms of unlocking investment.
Thank you, Benson. I think you can share links to for people to access those, and maybe we can disseminate them as we share the recording to this meeting. And now over to Dan. We've heard how we can make hydropower more efficient and more cost effective, but how do we ensure that equitable access to its benefits for the local communities?
Thank you very much, Peter and Benson. Yeah, actually, like we've just been mentioning, of course, we started by looking on the negative side of the environmental effects. But I think on the positive side, I have not come across any of the hydropower development projects that have not benefited the local communities. One, of course, just like we mentioned that before the project comes on board, that those people that are definitely going to be displaced, the project affected persons. But normally that displacement is positive because I think by law, people that have been displaced are entitled to having a kind of compensation in terms of finances, whether physical cash or in terms of being given in kind, like houses constructed for them and houses that are much better than what they initially occupied. So I think that's one of the biggest advantages that normally the people, the communities get when such a project is coming on board in their vicinity. But apart from that, they also, I think I also wanted to say that directly, there are direct benefits. For example, employment. When a project is coming on board, I think we have had a number of our people get jobs, most especially the casual laborers, but also the skilled labor force, like, for example, the artisanals, the equipment operators, and other kind of skilled personnel that join the project because they're benefiting from a project that has been put up in their vicinity. Normally, there are also indirect ones like support services, for example, accommodation. Some of these workers that are coming to work in the hydropower plant will need to be accommodated instead of traversing long distances to come and work on this plant, especially during the construction time. There'll be increased need for health services. So those that are having health facilities in the nearby places will also benefit. People that have means of transport, taxis, special hire, and all other kind of vehicles transporting people to and fro, they also benefit. Sometimes you have people that are maybe not directly keeping charge of equipment and stuff from the project, but like the visitors that are coming to the project, they need to store some of their property, some of their equipment, the nearby places before they access the hydropower development sites. So storage is also very important. Sometimes our people are involved in minor procurement deals. Others benefit from extension projects that are under the hydropower plant. Then we have, of course, on the larger scale, eventually, if there's a plant, a project in one place, the people that are originally not having power connections will eventually be able to be connected to the grid. And that is one of the priorities for the projects of hydropower development. The road networks, definitely, they are normally increased and improved together with urbanization of some of these places. You realize that a place that was much more kind of like rural eventually develops a town or a township or municipal council just because of the project that is being developed in the vicinity. So those are the key ones, maybe apart from the social ones, like people become friends, and some of them eventually develop long-term friendships, including marriages, and people with the people that have come to work on the hydropower plants. So I think those are some of the things that are key benefits to the communities when hydropower projects come within their vicinities. Peter.
Thank you, Dan. I think at this point we'll take a few questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can maybe unmute yourself and ask, or just raise your hand and ask the question. So I think one question to Benson. What are the financing mechanisms that are needed to accelerate investment in hydropower in Africa?
Thank you so much, Peter. So just writing down my thoughts around that. So yeah, I think just to paint the context again in terms of financing, I think, as I mentioned, of course, hydropower investment is quite cost intensive. And the African Development Bank, if I remember correctly, recently in collaboration with the International Hydropower Association, they did a mapping of the investment requirements for hydropower across the continent. And I think one of the key things that was outstanding is that it actually makes more economic sense, first and foremost, to even rehabilitate the existing hydropower projects and extend their lifespan and be in a position to generate more power than actually then starting to explore what we call greenfield or new hydropower projects, because then they become quite more expensive. And out of that, if I remember correctly, I think it's around 22.5 billion US dollars that would actually be required, even just for, but I could be able to check those figures and share. But I think around $22 billion required just for even rehabilitation of the existing hydropower projects. Now you can imagine, if then we are talking about this as cost for rehabilitation of the old ones or the existing ones, what does that mean then in terms of putting up new projects altogether? So I guess the whole point here is that certainly it's going to be a lot of financing that will be required. Now, is public finance going to be sufficient to unlock this investment requirement? Not at all. Not to mean that public finance is not important. It's quite important, yes. But I think one of the key things that you also need to explore is how do we unlock private capital then to be in a position to close the financing gap for hydropower projects. Now, and the reason I was getting into private capital, I think one of the key things, again, going back to one of the challenges that I mentioned about, is absolutely things to do with risk perception, again, political risks, for example, currency risks for the investors, etc. And so looking at how do we de-risk investment for hydropower, but again, also investment for other renewable energy technologies anyway, becomes quite critical. And I think this is where putting in place or identifying how, for example, institutions like the African Development Banks or the World Bank of this world can be in a position then to help in terms of providing de-risking mechanisms for private investors, for them, they can be in a position to feel confident to invest in some of these projects, I think would be quite ideal. And number two is guaranteeing or credit guarantee for, again, private investors that would be interested in financing some of these projects. Again, how do institutions like the World Banks of this world, the African Development Bank, but generally the multilateral development banks, what role can they be able to play in terms of providing credit guarantee in terms of financing hydropower projects? Now, I think one of the innovative financing that we have been seeing that is, I think, playing a critical role in terms of unlocking financing is green bonds. Basically fixed income loans for the finance and refinance of projects and assets that can be in a position to help address environmental and climate risks. And I think we have seen green bonds playing a critical role, both for hydropower, but also more important even for the other renewable energy projects as a whole. But I think, again, looking at how we can be able to tap into, or we can be able to utilize green bonds could be a critical option for financing or for unlocking climate finance for hydropower projects for that matter. Some of the models, again, that we are seeing, public-private partnership becoming quite critical. And I think those partnerships in helping national governments, for example, and even in some contexts where subnational governments have a unique role to play in terms of exploring some of these hydropower projects within their context. How do you support them to develop public-private partnership that can be in a position then to bring on board hydropower project developers and be in a position then to help in terms of unlocking the potential available within the hydropower. I think that's the way I would be able to summarize this. Oh yeah, and finally, concessional loans. I think going back again to the role that I was saying, seeing how, for example, institutions like KFDB and the World Banks could be in a position to provide access to concessional loans for national government or even for developers to be able to explore their existing hydropower potential or opportunities. And I apologize, Peter, sorry, just before you come in, I unfortunately have another meeting that was overlapping with this, and it started like 20 minutes ago, but I had excused myself to be able to join you until now. So if it's okay with you, I would really request to drop off at this point, unless there's a question that would be directly or would be directed to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent, for your insights. It's okay, you can leave right now. I think we can complete the session with Mr. Dan. So thank you so much again, and we look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and wishing you all the best with the remaining part of the session.
So I think from there, I'll just invite Mr. Dan Malone. Also a reminder that you can ask questions in the chat or raise your hand, and you'll get a chance to ask them. But in the meantime, let me just ask Dan to welcome Dan to give his final remarks on how hydro can actually power Africa's future. Dan.
Thank you very much, Peter. Also thank Benson in absentia. I would have loved to finish this race with him, but it's okay. We'll be able to go the 10 minutes that are remaining. Like we've already mentioned, we can't overemphasize the importance of hydropower amidst all other alternative energy sources, because hydropower has also been considered as one of the clean, renewable energy sources amongst the others. So there is still a lot of opportunities for us to develop hydropower in Africa, especially if you compare the demand that is raising every other day vis-a-vis the per capita consumption of about 450 kilowatt hours per annum. That's very low for the African continent compared to, I think, the average of about over 21 megawatt hours, which is a global average. In Africa, we are not really doing well at all. And given that we have only 10% of our people that access electricity in this continent, we shall remain behind if we don't pull up our socks. The good thing is that even the people of Africa have not just been waiting for developed countries to come and intervene. We have seen people in Africa with African origin and African entrepreneurs actually investing in hydropower projects. So I think so far the trend is not bad. Much as so far what we have is in northern Uganda, northern Africa, southern Africa, but we still can do a lot in terms of developing eastern, the western, and one of the factors that are conducive for our development of hydropower. Of course, we said if there is an abundant supply of water, especially the topography, if it's good, if the geology is stable enough, if there is demand, and if we have, especially if we are in deficit of other renewable energy sources, and if there is a good network of communication and transport, then it's good that we can be able to push forward hydropower. Benson talked about the African power pools. That's a very good way of increasing accessibility through global or rather regional electricity markets. Already we have 3 of them: East African power pool, the South African, and the West African power pool. Those are the ones that are ahead, but we're still having others that are coming on board. But I think they are giving us a good working environment for us to be able to have access to clean electricity through hydropower on the continent. He mentioned briefly about the transboundary projects. Of course, sometimes they are delayed by the differences in laws and procedures. Sometimes priorities at national level are a bit different. But in the long run, if all these have been harnessed, those are some of the best that we can use for developing hydropower. So as I conclude, Peter, we should harness the innovative technology like other countries are doing. If you can have, for example, the free flow turbines, which don't, of course, necessitate that we have high dams. High dams, of course, have been associated with environmental negative effects. So if you can be able also to have things like pumped storage, well, the water that goes can be pumped back so that along the way it generates hydropower. And then, of course, finally, countries are harnessing floating solar PV vis-a-vis where the hydropower plants are. I think that would also be a good, important tool for us to harness hydropower. So overall, there is still a lot of potential, and I think together we can do something about it to make sure that Africa increases access to electricity and clean energy through the development of hydropower. Peter.
Thank you, Dan. We have a question here from Mahu Kimtai, who's asking, how feasible is the development of small hydro plants in Kenya and Africa as a whole?
Is that directed to me or to Peter?
Yeah, you can tackle that, Mr. Dan.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I don't come from Kenya myself, but at least I know that the potential is immense. I think the tips I can give you, one, if you can be able to do your research and then get in touch, get on the ground, because small hydro is actually one of the best entry points into hydropower development. I know that on the forum in this meeting, we're having some of my colleagues from Uganda who are actually in development of small hydro, and they've had an increasing portfolio almost every year. So they'll encourage you that actually it's very feasible. But the important thing is consider starting small. It's very important to get a local partner, or at least a person or a company that knows the place geographically. Then you build relationships with the government and make sure that you can be able to follow your way through the licensing and permitting procedures. Then you can secure your rights for the projects before you even start spending money. I think the potential is immense and the feasibility is high, but you have to first of all be able to do some good homework, some groundwork.
Thank you, Dan. There's also a question now directed to you from Godfrey, who's asking, is there a fund that can be used for feasibility studies in Uganda?
Well, not any that I'm aware of. At least I know that personally there are a number of consultants that are conducting feasibility studies, both local and foreign. And the beauty of it all is that their rates are flexible. They don't have a standard rate. So sometimes it's good to look out for a person. If you can be able to look through the profile can tell you what kind of person you're looking for. But I'm not aware of any fund, whether government or private, towards feasibility studies.
Okay, thank you, Dan. You can continue sending your questions in the chat. At this moment, I'd like to invite Mr. Timothy Machi, who is a communications director here at We Planet Africa, to give us a little bit insight of the charcoal pledge that we started out with at the beginning of this session. So, Mr. Tim.
Hi, Peter. Hello, you can hear me?
Yes, you can hear you, Tim.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone who has joined, and thanks for this informative session. I'll briefly just talk about charcoal campaign that we have started. But just before I do that, at the heart of this campaign is a realization that charcoal is one of the biggest contribution to deforestation in Africa. But beyond doing that, we have also learned from different studies that charcoal actually is responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths of Africans due to indoor air-related pollution. It's mostly affecting mothers and kids who spend most of their time in poorly ventilated houses while cooking using either charcoal or even firewood. We have looked at all the possible options that we need, and some of them take a commitment from ourselves that there is something we can do to actually wean ourselves, our homes, our households, our families of charcoal. That's why we drafted a pledge where a member signs and says that I commit to reduce use of charcoal. Ultimately, we actually want 100% stoppage. But we also realize that change is usually gradual. If someone was using maybe several bags of charcoal per month or per year, we want them to probably reduce that by half as we get to a point where people transition to other forms of energy. Now, without talking about other forms of energies, which probably may be subject of discussion for another day, we are inviting members who think they can do something about reducing deforestation, who can do something about reducing carbon emissions, and who can do something about saving our mothers and small kids from effects of indoor air pollution. The starting point is I wanted to share in our. I'm going to share in this chat a link where we can probably copy a link to a pledge where we can probably copy and send or save rather. But Peter, I think, can also undertake to send to members who have signed on to today's meeting so that they can go through at their time, but not just at their time, but also take initiative to take a step. I know most of us who are on this call may not necessarily be using charcoal, but we come from probably families where our mothers and our siblings are using charcoal. It just takes one little step. Can I help my mom to move off charcoal, to move off firewood? Can I get them, for example, a gas? I know there is debate about gas not being a clean energy. Part of the fossil fuels, but looking at it in comparison to charcoal, it has a way cleaner carbon emission profile, and its effects are way less. But also, it's a better way to transition so that for those who cannot move directly from charcoal to electricity, can gradually move from charcoal to gas before they go on to now a clean energy proper. So I've seen Peter, I think, has shared the link. I invite all of us to look at it. Let us sign. And when we sign, I know most of us will probably have already moved, but we can still, there is still one person within our circles, our parents, our grandfathers, grantees. Can we reach out to them and say, I just say, what can I do to help my people move or reduce consumption of charcoal? Because in so doing, we help to win communities, to our families from forests, which helps actually in reducing carbon emissions. But we also save our brothers and sisters from indoor air-related pollution diseases. Peter?